host. Okay. And I think we are now live.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Leonid Bloom's Everything I Know series with Stephen Levin. My name's Graham Scarr and I'm coming to you from Nottingham in the UK. And what we're presenting is part of the Biotensegrity Party, which is an all-volunteer production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive, which part of the mission of the archive is to educate, raise public awareness and build community in the field of biotensegrity, and to foster and forward discovery, research and understanding in the fields of science, health and medicine. If you want to know more about biotensegrity, for those on YouTube, if they connect with the biotensegrityarchive.org, sign up for the free newsletter, you'll be able to have information about what's on in the near future. So I'm here with my co-host, Chris Clancy.
Hi, everyone, from just outside of Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish Nation in Canada.
And Susan Lowles de Solórzano.
Hey, everybody. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Chris. In a moment, we're going to go live to the video. What I will say is, what will I say?
We also want to mention Leonid because he's here with us and Steve's here with us. And yeah. I will say that you may not know this, but it's like we have to, I'll use the old wrestling metaphor. We have to wrestle Steve to the mat every time we do this. He really is not a fan of listening to or talking about himself, but for the rest of us, we felt that the educational value has been so amazing. And we're grateful to Leonid for somehow managing to get Steve to sit in front of a camera that long.
It wasn't that difficult, you know. You see, you look at his hat now, right? So it's really asks for another invitation, you know, to be filmed. So this is really an elegant piece. So and yeah.
Well, also let me say he's wearing his shirt is from the National Conservation Training Center. Steve, from when you were medical director of, you give me that title. You're muted.
I was medical director of National Park Service National Capital Region, which is 12 area parks extending out to Harper's Ferry and in one direction to West Virginia and Antietam into Maryland. So it was, and including the Washington D.C. area. It was a volunteer job. It was a fun job. I really had a good time there.
Thanks, Steve. And of course, this is part of the Biotensegrity Party, and we're having more discussion, questions, and mingling after the video. But to start with, as always, we have a toast. So grab a glass of your favourite tipple and we'll toast Biotensegrity, Stephen Levin, and the future of biology. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. L'chaim.
So you chaps like to turn your videos off now and we'll get on with the video.
Leonid, did you want to say anything before we start?
Actually, not really. I think it's a very kind of, it's a good episode. So
this I agree.
So, you know, I hope that everybody is going to enjoy it. And we're looking forward to hear their, you know, the comments.
Here we go. Looks good, everybody? Oh, wait a minute. I know what I didn't do right. Oh, sorry. Forgot to share sound. Share sound. This will be even better because you'll get to hear it.
Well, dear friends, we're continuing our Everything I Know series with Dr. Stephen Levin, and the previous episodes were really fascinating, going through this very special journey that preceded the tensegrity and the biotensegrity understanding. And now I guess it's the time that we get closer to the say discovery, or that moment of the realization itself, and then how the times revolved around it, and what were the other experiments and tests and the practical applications that Steve tried to do in order to kind of validate his concept and test it for himself in the first place. Steve, you get the...
Well, let's see, so we were left off, I think we were talking about cranes. And
Yes.
and the concept of a truss being the stable structure. And so I was looking for some sort of truss system that I could use, but I of course recognize that animals are omnidirectional, creatures are omnidirectional, and all the truss systems I was looking at were unidirectional. You can only put them in one way where they function as a truss. And so I spent a lot of time in the Natural History Museum looking at structures there, at the animals there. Then I looked at books on architecture. I linked in with a fellow named Nicholas Hotton at the Smithsonian, who was head of the paleontology department.
Nicholas Hotton, paleontology department, so that's the one that deals with dinosaurs and so on.
Right.
Okay.
The Smithsonian is a wonderful place, and I wanted to do this. I wanted to learn something about the mechanics of the dinosaurs and things. So I said, well, what better place to do it is to check in with the Smithsonian. So in those days, the Smithsonian had a switchboard with operators in it, and I called the Smithsonian. I said, I'd like to speak to somebody who knows something about the mechanics of dinosaurs.
Oh, so it was a real switchboard with a person there.
Switchboard with a person there.
Okay, so it's not press one.
No,
if you
no.
get the number and so.
This is a real live person answers the phone, and I said, I give her the spiel, and the Smithsonian is set up this way that if people ask for something, they will try to accommodate you. And I didn't know that, but I just called them up. I found that out later. And I said, is there somebody there I can speak to? And she said, just a minute, please. And the next thing I know is that Nick Hotton here. Well, little did I know his importance. He was head of the Paleontology Society for the United States. And I mean, he was a really big buckety-buck in paleontology. And I told him whatever. He said, well, come on down. And I came on down, and I used to go down there once a week or so almost, and spent 2 or 3 hours with him touring the dinosaurs. And what you see in the front room are the big dinosaurs. What you see in the back room is shelves and shelves, actually drawers, full of bones. And you slide out these bones, and
So you got the access to the back room through this?
Yeah.
Okay, so you were not just a regular visitor who was just
no.
cruising the hall, but...
No, Nick and I spent hours talking about these things, and he'd show me these different dinosaurs and the different things, and we discussed things like, how the pelvis sits, and of course they have different pelvises, and, the bones, and we're trying to figure this all out. So I keep going down there and
So he was very curious about the thing himself. As a paleontologist, how would the skeletons fit, and how did get the bones and the missing ones, what they would actually mean, as far as I see, right?
He at least said he was, and yes, he was. And he was really a super guy, because over the years I didn't speak to him periods of time, and maybe 5 years at a time sometimes, when I was working on another aspect of it. And I'd say, well, I need to know more stuff of it, and I'd pick up the phone and call him, and he said,
"Oh, Steve, I was just thinking about you." Of course, he wasn't, but that was nice of him to say. But I really developed this nice relationship with him, and he was really very helpful in explaining what their concepts were. But of course, you go to the museum and you see this, a diplodocus with a neck that goes all the way out there, and then you look and there's a steel rod that goes in the middle of it, and there's wires that go up to the ceiling to hold it up. And now the neck is at least 16 vertebrae long, which, by the way, is the same as birds. They have about 16 cervical vertebrae. But if you look at the tail is at least 100 bones long.
100 bones.
At least 100. You lose count of them. And you got this big long tail. And Nick says to me, he says, and I knew I was being set up. He says, that these animals kept their tails up in the air. I said, how do you know that? He says, because in the sands of time, you see footprints, but not tail tracks.
I really love that expression. You see, obviously I heard it before from you, but this one about the tail tracks is really, but so it means that they actually found the footprints, right?
Oh yeah, these are
multiple footprints.
Oh yeah, you see, one of the reasons they knew how fast dinosaurs moved were the different paces of the footprints.
Oh wow, I actually never sort of delved into this dimension. So that's so it's enough footprints to deduce the actual speed.
When they were walking and when they were running.
Wow.
Not only that, but they could deduce that some of those huge creatures would run at a speed of 25 miles an hour. I mean, these were moving creatures. Some of some of these big ones would still really move fast.
So at the same time, the tail that would, by right, would be a very heavy item.
Heavy, long,
and very long.
And flexible, and like a whip.
Like
and
a whip,
they would use it as a whip, theoretically, and swing it back and forth.
But it didn't drag.
Didn't drag on the ground. So it means that you have to hold up a flexible thing that's, 30 foot long, flailing
30 foot long, 9 meters in the metric system.
9 meters in the metric system.
So it's like from the ground to a third floor. So effectively.
But long, you're right, and with at least 100 bones in it. And you can go to the museum and you can see this huge tail on these things.
But I think that this is really a very interesting thing because, we are very much shaped by our observations, right? So, and if you think today, we actually don't have the large animals with big tails.
Right.
In the modern fauna, there is, like, what is about the elephant? The elephant has this little stick dangling there, and well, okay, it has a trunk, which it also keeps up, but we naturally think that
there's no bones in the trunk.
Yeah, that's it. There's no bones, and it's on the front, and so on and so forth. So, but then the mega tail, there aren't any animals with that. So this is really a very interesting perspective there.
Yeah. So we would talk about how does this tail work, because you have to recognize that, you think of, well, in the neck they have these spiny processes and things like that, but in the tail, all the muscles are right close, hanging on to those bones, and there's no way of getting any leverage in this thing. It's all, and so from a mechanical standpoint, it made absolutely no sense.
Speaking of mechanical standpoint, we talk about the the liver system as such, right?
Right.
So that's
right.
If we were trying to extend the liver system understanding.
Thinking of it as a lever system, since all the muscles are firmly attached to the bones and they go all the way out there, and there's no big spikes holding them up, then they have to somehow or other figure out how in a lever system they can possibly work.
Okay, so maybe let's give it a little bit more of the shot. So in that respect, what we see even today in the analysis of the human spine, for example, the presence of those spikes for the liver system looks as it's treated, calculation-wise, it's treated as a very important thing.
Right.
So because if you need the extra sort of hooking point in order to be able to get the right.
Right, to get any support at all, you need something sticking out in another direction,
That's
far enough.
far enough, getting in the other direction.
Right. Now, in the human spine, that distance is considered to be about 5 centimeters.
So 2 inches, 5 centimeters.
Right,
Okay.
right.
And in the dinosaur spines,
In the dinosaur spines, you know, it's all variable, but it doesn't go very, certainly in the tail, it doesn't stick out far enough to give you anything in a huge tail as they had. And in the neck, the same thing. You're talking about these neck, you know, that are meters long. You would need to have spines that go up all the way up, you know, 10 meters, some of them to support something that's long like that and flexible. Then again, if you got a spine sticking up that way, if the poor creature got on the side or anything like that, there's no way it could get up. You see, because that makes it
essentially a flat item.
right, it's like a mast on a ship that sticks up. If you turn a ship on the side, the mast isn't worth anything anymore.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so what you're looking for in, say, supporting the tail or supporting the neck would be a rigid pole going up that's like a mast on a ship. And usually guy wires on the side to hold that up. But there is nothing like that in any animal that's sufficient enough to
Okay,
support
so
it.
just to sort of give it a little bit more of an extra taste, right? So we got back to this, you know, 10 years prior to that, the first introduction of biomechanics. The thing that actually made you uncomfortable there is the calculation, the famous calculations when the person just bends down to pick up the piece of paper. Then that would be one lever arm, and then to counteract this, just a little tiny thing on the back.
Exactly.
With at least a 10x ratio. So, you know, if you were to lift whatever, like 20, 30 pounds, then suddenly the whole forces to counteract it, they run into hundreds of pounds.
Correct.
Now, if we take the dinosaur, then instead of the, you know, 1 meter or whatever, 3-4 feet long, or well, even 2 feet.
Right.
Well, let's say 1 meter long
Right.
upper body of the human. We talk about the weight, which would be 10 times the weight, and the length, which would measure its, you know, like 3-4 times. We would talk about 3-4 meters sitting on the point. So that's, I mean, I just
All right.
really to visualize this.
All right. Let's add the other components to this. There's no evidence that the bones of these creatures were any denser than the bones of a mouse. in a
That's another.
sense.
Well, that's the second.
Well,
level.
but this is the stuff that I gathered from Nick Hotton, is that we would talk about things like that. The bones were the same density, so that means you would need massive bones to do anything.
Okay, so that's another point there, right? So that because when nowadays what we're dealing with fossils. Fossils, that's mineralized, super rigid thing, so which kind of creates this impression of something really, you know, like it's a item, it's a rock that can hold and withstand a lot of things. So, and that kind of inside knowledge, which brings you into the perspective that those giant bones were still, density-wise, not that different from the ones of a mouse, that's a very important inside perspective, which is not so obvious, I would say.
Yes, exactly. Now, when you start doing the math, you understand when you're, volume-wise, if you're going up the scale, you have run into Galileo's square cube law. So as you square the surface area, you have to cube the volume. So that would mean that if you increase the size of the creature from, say, a mouse to 100 times that, which is actually the size of an elephant,
Yeah.
you would have to, the thickness of the bone would be 1,000 times thicker,
Absolutely.
you see. So that there's no way these bones could do this.
And on top of this, if we get the basic mv square for anything related to the kinetic energy, right? So you see m you know, as the M grows and the V square goes up, so then at 25 miles an hour, this, if we think about the momentum and any kind of whatever momentary accelerations, the impulse things that they would have, it would be just absolutely massive numbers.
Right. Plus, there's also no evidence that the muscles were any different. They may have been bigger, but the actual, at a fiber level, it would be exactly the same.
You mean
So
composition-wise?
the composition of a muscle is the same. All our animals have essentially the same composition of muscle as far as the individual fiber strength.
And this is where we get to the point that, you know, when we label the muscles as a muscle, we also obviously have to remember that there is no such thing as the elementary fiber that runs, you know, let's say for for a foot, right? So it's always a mesh of the same fibers, which is with the intermission.
Right, you're still working with a fine mesh of fibers. You know, it's like a silk net, sort of, and it doesn't make any difference how big it is. It's still a silk net. So, you know, so this were some of the things I'm gathering from working with Nicholas Hotton.
But did he give you the insight, like how they arrived to this type of conclusions?
No.
So he just sort of projected and say, hey.
Well, oh, you mean told me? Well, yeah. I mean, this was a ongoing discussions of the things that they knew, and you know, and do it. Because if you go back and trace animals, they're all the bones are essentially the same. And so when they turn to stone, they have to make assumptions at certain levels, but whatever they can, you know.
Okay, but just to sort of clarify the level of authority here. So Nick Hotton was the head or the chair of the American Paleontology Society, or
At one point he was that. He was the head of paleontology at the Smithsonian for umpteen years, and you know.
okay, so we're talking about the person who was absolutely a world-class expert on anything that has to do with fossils and the particular.
Absolutely.
So, and one of the deductions there, as far as I understand, is that there still was this whole spectrum of animals at the dinosaur time, right? So they say, and that's the whole point, is that they were more or less the same composition.
Right, and one day he holds up a bone no bigger than this, and he says, well, do you know that this was the femur of a full-size dinosaur? And it was that time that he says, oh, they came in all sizes. He says, we just get fancy with the big ones because they're so impressive. But dinosaurs they had chicken-sized dinosaurs. So
in that sense, the whole layout, the leg plus the femur and so on, the whole layout is actually a very ancient design, survived a lot of different, because climate-wise, energy-wise, and it was a very different, and you know, oxygen-wise, and so it was a very different climate, right?
absolutely, but at the same time, they all survived, and the same plan survived.
The same plan. So if we talk about so effectively, to a great extent, their chemical homeostasis was very different.
Yes.
So there was a lot more variables there because of the temperature and the gas content and so on. So we don't really know exactly how it was, but in that respect we can assume that their mechanical homeostasis actually has quite a remarkable similarity with the modern times and the modern mammals even.
Yes.
In terms of if we talk about the composition, muscle, bone, soft tissues, and the whole sort of spectrum of what we call fascia nowadays.
There's no reason to think of them much different than the birds, in a sense, without wings.
Okay.
But so the structure was adapted to it, and this is what I got from working with Nicholas. That this was, there was a consistency right through, so that I didn't have to think of them as some magical thing. These were animals, and what pertained to them probably pertained to us in many ways. So I still was stuck with having to figure out how this tail and this neck, and they hedged their bets, and they said, well, it must work, mostly, and they just don't they really didn't get much into the mechanics.
Okay, but that's a good point, because you see, we talk about intelligent people, we talk about the entire profession, and I would say that especially if we think about the 60s and 70s, the whole drive of the profession, or the whole draw of this profession, was much higher than today. So the paleontologist in the 70s was much higher ranked in the society than the paleontologist today, right? So you see, because with the discovery of the bones and so on and so on, there was a lot of even attached sort of celebrity status there. So there were better funding, better, you know, all these things. So the question is, how in those, and since you had this closer relationship with him, so how did they handle this kind of open questions? So there were no tail tracks in the sand of time. That's a beautiful expression.
Right.
But how did they handle it? So what was their hypothesis?
They essentially ignored it. In the sense they said, well, it works, you know, they just says it works in the lever system and accepted it as such. That was still the model for it. The same lever system, you know, that we used for the last 300 with Borelli. It's the same thing. But they never really did the math on it. They just made assumptions that what was going to happen, and they never even some of them. There's one or two of them do things like scaling up a chicken to dinosaur size, because we assume by that time they started understanding that birds were the descendants of the dinosaurs.
That was just that was at that time.
Yes.
So it was not yet because by now that's sort of an established theory.
No, it was just very early in it.
Okay, so we're kind of getting back in time again. Yeah. So some of this established theories which you witnessed.
But they were getting there. And so, but they're talking about, and they said, well, the birds, you know, so they do things like scale up a chicken. But they never really did it, so they didn't scale up the bones to cube the bones. And they didn't do some of that stuff. They just sort of pretended it got big. And they would say, well, in order for the chicken to run at that speed, there'd have to be such and such, and huge muscle masses and things like that. So they were playing those kind of games, but they never left that one model. And they never fully explained all the failures that you get if you're using that model. They just sort of ignore the obvious failures.
Okay, but let me highlight this point a little bit, because you see, from a distance we have a tendency to think of the sciences in general and the scientists as the people who get, you know, the moment they find even a small inconsistency in their theories and the explanations, basically all of them leave what they've been doing right now and gather together and, you know, never and relentlessly start pursuing the thing until they fix this inconsistency in the problem. That's a kind of an image that the people who are not part of the sort of scientific insight or the inner circle, that's the image that the science projects onto the society. But obviously, if we start looking through the history of science, the number of omissions, the number of this kind of blatant, just like, okay, you know, it challenges the paradigm too much, so let's just put it into the, you know, like, that's for the next generation.
Right.
So that's, okay, but we sort of see, let's not...
But the problem is they didn't have another model to go to. So they were stuck with this one model, and they were trying to fit everything, squeeze everything into this one model, but there was no alternative for them.
So that's another very difficult subject, if you put it this way, right? So the efforts which are related to sort of disproving the old model, they are kind of usually directly proportional to the presence of the alternative model.
Right.
Because, you know, these are humans, you know?
Right, they don't have any other place to go. So they're squeezing everything, trying to fit into this model. And they would say things, well, we don't understand quite how it worked in this thing. But they couldn't abandon that model because they had no other place to go. They would just, you know, where do we go from here? we don't have a fun, this is our model and this the only one we have to work with. So they're stuck. So they stayed stuck. And so they would try and explain everything on this one model because it was the only model they had.
So effectively, because you see, that's also one of the examples that I keep kind of seeing there. It's an interesting thing, right? Is that if we start looking at this kind of emission and the sort of cutoff segregation. So, for example, if you look at it at sort of face value, it's really strange that, for example, embryology is not studied in detail through medical school. By right, what you're dealing with is the person who has evolved, and there is a whole genesis of the tissues and so on and so forth, but at best, it's just kind of, like familiarity course of
Right.
whatever, 10 hours.
Right.
So the same thing is that so thinking of this one, bringing a certain concept to extreme and really thinking through what happens with those mega tails, why this damn thing didn't drag, at least temporarily, or at least when you were running or whatever.
Right.
It's like, you see, you can think of all sorts of things there. So that is really like a willingness, because both of those ends, whether it's the embryo, whether it's the supersize, they really start challenging the comforts of the mid-size model.
Right.
So the mid-size model, either the geometry or just the calculation, the moment arms, everything sort of works.
Right.
But then once you start squeezing it or scaling it up, it stops working. But then you really, are you going to postpone this, or are you going to challenge yourself?
Yeah,
That's really the question.
Questions, sometimes they miss the questions. So you look at Tyrannosaurus Rex. We all know this
The
big
T-Rex,
right. And we know, and what's the Triceratops is even a better example.
Okay.
So you get this Triceratops, which is a huge thing, and it has legs that look like a trunk of a tree.
Mm.
When we depict it as such. So you look there and you say, well, look, it's got these big legs on it.
Solid support.
Right. So you go look at the bones, and you get big bones there and big bones there, and then you get to the toes. And they're walking on 3 toes like that at this very odd angle. And there's no way they would have any muscles big enough there to hold those toes up. And it makes so they're not standing on a big tree trunk, they're standing on 3 little toes and 3 little, relatively sized 3 little bones.
So you don't see this kind of convenient big thing so that it would be a solid
Right.
mega platform.
Right, and you go to the next room in the museum, and you look at the elephant, and they have the same thing. This big, what you think is this big leg of a tree trunk kind of thing going down. When you get down to the foot part, they're walking on 3 little toes.
Similar to the
Yeah,
small.
and you go see the giant sloths there that are, 3 meters tall and huge things, and they're walking on the side of their little foot down there. And you say, well, the thing's built upside down. There's no way we could do that. So what looks like a big, massive tree trunk of a limb that's stiff and straight is really angled so that it would create all sorts of forces, and standing on little teeny toes. Now these are things I was doing when I was in the museum, was looking at all this stuff.
So effectively, that would mean that if we were to build a pyramid, like some
Right,
kind of
right.
mega construction there, or a column, so suddenly you've got one of those famous Greek columns, thick and strong, and then instead of putting it on a proper pedestal, you're saying, okay, I've done all that stuff, now let's just kind of make a tiny thing underneath and hope that it's going to kind of hold it
Not
balance
just
better.
tiny, at a crazy angle.
At a crazy angle on top.
On top of it. And there's a weird act. And then add to that mobility. It's not just standing there, it's running. And if it's running, you know, and you say things like, well, look at the hippopotamus. The hippopotamus runs 25 miles an hour. It's not,
And
you
it
know,
stops quite efficiently.
yeah, you know, and so, and again, so you're looking at it, something like that, and you keep thinking of this tree trunk legs, but when you know, get away all that soft tissue and look at the bones that are supposed to be the pillars that are holding up, they're measly little things that couldn't possibly do it.
So that's a very interesting thing here, but like how the mind plays with those things, because on the one hand, we indeed see those the tree trunk legs of an elephant, and that gives us a kind of a reassuring feeling that, well, everything is nice and right in this world. It's like a tree trunk, it's like whatever, it's like a column, solid support. But then, if we continue this to the extension that we believe that it's the hard bones being the source of anchoring, support, and so on, that actually being the main weight-bearing element, rather than the soft tissue, so then that's where we run into troubles as far as I see.
That's right. And so this, when you, of course, at the museum, you see all these skeletons. So when you start playing around and really looking at the skeletons with all the, you know, the dressing off it, you really then understand that we're asking them to support themselves on these often three bones, sometimes, you know, sometimes two, sometimes the side of one bone, and you're looking at these things and you say, well, it can't be done.
And we're getting back to a classic statement that everybody happily repeats, that the chain is no stronger than its weakest link, right? So, and that really looks very much like a weakest link in this particular system.
Well, so these relatively little toes, and they really are little for the creatures, you know, are supposed to be supporting it. And not only that, well, you say, well, we got muscles. Well, you don't have enough muscles down there to do anything. If you look at a thing like a crane, you know, they got a little skinny leg and they're walking, you know, that's a long thing, and they're walking on these very skinny toes at the very bottom, you know, and what's holding these toes and what's giving them muscle. So you have to rethink all these things in a different structural pattern. So the outside dressing is just that, outside dressing. It really doesn't give you full information of what's going on within the animal, the structural things. And it certainly can't be, at least from my spending all that time with the bones, it can't just be the bones that do it.
So putting it softer, you know, like, and removing the sort of the strong words can't be, that's impossible, and so on. So that's, at least there is a serious, like the concept that we've been brought up with, that it's the bones which are the essence of the support and so on. That concept you had, the more you went into the thing, the more you had sort of legitimate doubts about as of the explanatory power of this concept. So it really faced troubles at the further you move from the mid-sized creatures, the more challenges this concept faces.
Exactly. When you know, a fly can walk on a wall, but you can't get an elephant to walk on the wall. So if you go and blow these things up to the large thing, you see the ridiculousness of some of our assumptions that this bone work, you know, this little bone could do it. And then you even things like, I would look at things like the scapulas of all these creatures. The scapulas on quadrupeds are on their sides and they're sticking up in the air, and there's no bony connection between the shoulder girdle and the trunk of the animal. So you know that the animal is being held up like a hammock between these columns of what we envision as columns of the limbs, at least in the upper, you know, in the upper part. So there's no bony connection between the scapula and the axial skeleton, the spine and the trunk of the body. And And it's very obvious when you go and look at all these skeletons. It's there.
Well, the assumption would be that there will be some mega powerful muscles holding it, right? So that's
Right, but you can't lever through a muscle. You can only pull on a string. So there was no way of putting lever forces through the muscles. You see, you would be hanging by ropes, essentially. So,
okay. So, but this type of the
But
conversation will probably need to get some drawings into, so to get
Okay.
it better visualized. But
this-
it's just
but
to
this
get the
is-
idea.
These are all the things that I was doing, studying the skeletons for months on end, you know, and discussing these problems. And then problems arise, and most of the time it was, well, we don't really know how this happened.
So just to kind of really put the timestamp correctly. So all that happened still before you had the Biotensegrity
Oh
model.
yeah, I was. This is why I was there. I was looking for. a
Okay,
way
so
to-
I think that this is really important for the understanding of the thing, not to confuse the timing here. So actually, what happened first is that you were looking, you know, you struck this relationship with the gentleman who was, you know, one of the leading paleontologists
Right.
at the time. So he gave you a lot of this inside information, which kind of gave you the link between your, say, clinical practice and your primary experience, biological experience with the humans, right? But then you saw that the sizes were dramatically different, the tails sort of hang up in the air. Then you figured out from this gentleman that instead of this super mineralized, super hard fossils, in fact those were quite sort of softish bones which you experienced firsthand in humans, right, as the orthopedic surgeon. Then you also got the understanding that, well, the muscles there were similar. They were not, you know, like not some special super, you know, ropes or
Steel cable,
something like the
right.
steel cables. So they were also the same mesh made out of the same principle, the way the fibers and so on, how they connected. But you, at that point in time, you still had questions. You didn't have the answer. But
Oh, no.
you were frustrated for the lack of
Right.
answers. But you had just you were walking around with the open questions.
Yes.
So
I had no answers. I didn't know where I was going.
So that is a very important thing, right? So the courage to ask the question and not knowing yet the ready-made answer, right? So that it's just kind of a boiling dissatisfaction with how the things are.
Now it kept intensifying because things that I might be able to get away with in a thing the size of a human, there was no getting away from it in the size of a dinosaur. You know, of the giant, or even the giant mammals that, you know, the giant sloths and the.
Yeah, that's a fantastic comment there, right? Because that's the thing. So you first got dissatisfied with the hundreds of pounds of force within the human bodies, right? But then, you know, which operated on, say, on the levers, which would be, say, 2 foot,
Right.
2 foot long, right? Or 2 feet long, 3 feet long, and so on. Suddenly, you're getting into the situation when you're dealing with 10 feet and triple the mass and 10 times the mass and so on. So that's
Right.
where it was a boiling dissatisfaction.
Right. I mean, once you start saying, well, you know, you look at these creatures and you realize that material-wise you're dealing with the same material as the human body, and you're building up to these sizes, there is no way that these animals could possibly exist using the mechanical concepts that we had
At the time. But I think that, like, let's sort of finish this episode on this note, because I really want to emphasize this. It's because when we look from our times, like, you know, it's 45 years back or 50 years back, 45 years back and 50 years back, they blend. You know, it's all a long time ago. But the sequence here for me is absolutely crucial. That it's not that you kind of got a pet concept and say, oh wow, I saw this Nelson Tower and now I'm going to sort of plug everything that I see in the world that I'm going to plug into this concept.
no. I had no idea of the Snelson Tower
So,
at the time, except I had seen it at the Herschel, but
but you
there
didn't
was
even
no,
connect it.
it wasn't, not only, I didn't even, it wasn't even a thought in my mind.
So the same thing with Fuller and, you know, let's say with Fuller and the Expo in Montreal, you know, the
Yeah, those were just pictures.
pictures in the newspapers.
Right, pictures in the newspaper. I never read it. Well, this book wasn't out by that time, but no, I hadn't read anything about him or anything. I knew about geodesic domes. That's it.
But I just under this label, like they could have been
And
called the Fuller domes or
Right,
whatever.
and I didn't know any connection between Snelson's sculpture and Fuller. I didn't know that there was any connection between the two.
Okay, so
I
but
didn't know about Snelson, except I'd seen his tower at the Herschel.
so just basically as if he was another sculptor or painter.
Right.
So it could have been a Statue of Liberty. Well, I mean, like a Statue of Liberty, but you know,
Right,
it
right.
could have been some other modernist kind of sculpture, right? So
There were Rodin sculptures there, and there was a Snelson sculpture. I looked at the two of them. That was nice.
and it was nice. Okay, so that is, but so that's why I think it's really critical for us to make this thing, is that because if we are kind of recreating this journey and sort of putting ourselves in these same shoes, right? You see, effectively, you know, one can put yourself in the same shoes and say, hey, you know what? Okay, I don't know anything about the tensegrity, biotensegrity, and so on. You know, let's remove this concept for a time being. So, but we are actually getting back to the same question. So 50 years later, if we start asking the same question, how did the large-scale animals got the control of their necks, got the controls of their tails, got the controls of their weight on those toes and so on? The fact is that the model which is being offered today is still the same model, and even though the computing power has really improved, there are some critical, you know, challenges within the assumptions and the applications of the model that makes it not capable of giving the like steady and simple, like straightforward explanation. So that's what I feel, that in that respect, if we look at the listener, reader, you know, aspiring researcher of today, so effectively they would be in the same, once they start asking the same questions and paying attention to the same phenomena as you did, a person today would be exactly in the same shoes.
Right. You just have to ask those questions.
So that's, I think, is really the very, very important thing, so that we don't glue the things kind of with the ready-made answer. We get back and say, well, no, look, that's, you know, put yourself in the shoes, roll back the time and say, hey, do you have better answers to the, you have to ask these questions to test the validity of the current model,
Right.
and number two, well, if those ones, if you don't get the good answers within the current model, then, you know, the search is on. What other model would be a better fit?
Right.
Fantastic.
And at that time, there was no other model. So they tried to squeeze everything into that model.
Great. Well, I think that we made a very important step and a very important dissociation in this history. So those events, even though they were kind of getting close to each other, right? And you see, even from your previous, you know, stories and so on, I didn't get such a clear thing, because a lot of things were kind of, the scene is Smithsonian, the time is the early 70s, so everything kind of blends, right? But this is really, we started to deconstruct it, and we started seeing it, you know, it's not that simple. It's early 70s, but 1973 is very different from 1975, right? And being to Smithsonian, not for the tower, but for the just kind of getting the architecture, and then to get better architectural experience and understanding, and then, you know, being in the same hall, and then seeing the animals, and then having this experience of talking to the elite paleontologist at this time. So that's actually the critical part that allows us to recreate it and say, hey, you know, reader, viewer, researcher, you know, if you don't like the road that I have taken, you know, roll back and offer something else. But don't ignore these questions.
Right.
So that's really,
questions that are
so,
important.
so you see that, in fact, this is what I really want to highlight, that your central message to the, modern audience is not even biotensegrity itself to begin with. It's as a version of an answer. Your first message is say, hey guys, let's ask the questions, let's test the validity of our models to the true extreme, right? And see whether it holds, right?
Right.
So that's really what I call integrity. Okay, fantastic.
All right. I'm reminded so much when you get to the end there of that Louis Pasteur quote about how fortune favors the prepared mind. And Leonid, what you brought out so well in the interview is how Steve was in that state of having the prepared mind in order to recognize the value of what was to come.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But you see, actually, like after rewatching this episode, and I think it's kind of, it's one of the shorter ones, and we sort of edited it that way. But I think it's really, really critical, right? Because I can only repeat what we kind of bumped into back then, right? So you see that when we are looking back now, okay, that was 2020, now it's 2023. So the events of 1970, 1972, 1973, 1975, they all blend together, right? Like we look in retrospect, and everyone who comes on board now would tend to do this conflation and kind of packing again and say, hey, you know what, you have a pet concept, you are just kind of trying to mold the reality into this concept, and you are oblivious to the other things. So, but this factor, the deconstructing the timing and getting to the fact that, hey, the questions really, really, really preceded it, and also kind of seeing this serendipities along the way, I think it's very critical. It kind of allows to recreate the journey, and in the first place, kind of, brings the questions ahead of the answers. Well, unfortunately, I must say that most of the people are not very comfortable with the questions. They don't have immediate answers, but yeah, that's kind of one of the things. But I guess that's the way how the things develop, right? So you have to start with a burning question, and that it burns enough that it starts kind of bringing some invite the answers.
Yes.
So well, there were great comments there in the chat by Craig
Yes.
Nevin, with the
Craig
toes,
Nevin and
and
Steve
by
Shepard.
Steven from about the Kuhn's idea. So you see, gentlemen, if you are ready to show up and kind of throw in maybe this in a kind of articulated way rather than just in comments, that would be great. Maybe there's
we also have
room to elaborate.
Dr. Michelle Taranto, who's a really early adopter of Biotensegrity. Leonid, when did you meet Michelle?
2011 it was in Munich at Robert Schleip's place.
No, actually, Michelle and I met in England, didn't we? It was in England.
I mean, I met her there.
My English was not so good, but I tried.
But you were very enthusiastic, yes. So
yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to confuse things. Steve, when did you meet Michelle?
I think I met Michelle, and I think I did a course in England, I think that she was at.
Yeah.
Is that right, Michelle? And
In
that
Mexico.
was, yeah, that was years earlier.
I was lucky because, in fact, Steve gave this conference, and nobody was knowing he was giving this conference because it was something decided by the school very late, and there were only 7 participants. So I was lucky because I could ask so many questions during 2 days to Steve. And it was for me a revolution in my life. And for Steve, it was really bad luck because so few people, but when it was not a problem, I think, for him. He was so happy because people were so interested, and it was really challenging for him to speak in the biggest school of osteopathy in England, in Maidstone. It's the most well-known school. So for me, it was a shock because when he said his goodbye, he said, tomorrow in the same place, the teacher will teach classical biomechanics. And I thought, he's right. Nothing will change. But for me, everything has changed.
But the reason it was such a small class is because there was a conflict in scheduling, and they scheduled Bob Ward at the same weekend. And Bob Ward was professor at Michigan State University in manual therapy, who I got to know quite a bit well later. But actually, I knew him then too. But he was there, and there was a conflict because he was teacher, and of course, the interest of the group of the school was more in how to do things rather than how understand what they were doing. So they certainly went to see Bob Ward first, who was quite good at what he did.
Yes. So thank you, Steve. I'm so grateful and so happy to be in this Biotensegrity group for so long time. And for me, it's also my second family.
Yeah. I have to tell a story about that meeting because I stayed in a hotel on a little road outside of town, outside of Maidstone was the town. And the road was called Pilgrim's Road. And it took me a while to realize that I was on the road that Chaucer traveled and told the Chaucer's tale because it's on the way to Coventry or wherever it is. But it was, and the hotel was supposed to be on the grounds of where one of the stops were along the road of Chaucer's Pilgrim's Tales. So I was really thrilled by being there. It was very exciting for me. Completely unrelated to what's going on now.
Wow.
Anyway, what happens, it comes down to the same thing that I keep pushing, is that unless the people are unhappy with their paradigm, they're not going to change. And I wasn't happy with my paradigm. And until I think one of our jobs is to make people uncomfortable with the paradigm they have so that they can then move on and try other things. So it wasn't that I had something I had a plug in there. I was unhappy with the paradigm I had. And I think that's so important for us to recognize that and work with people. So I went back to the Dinosaurs guy, and it was people would come here sometime and I'd take them for tours of the museum and discuss these things on the obvious inconsistencies of looking at a dinosaur and understanding the mechanics in the concept of Borelli with levers and things like that. So unless you get these people to get uncomfortable with their present paradigms. Now, most manual therapy people are already uncomfortable with the paradigm. They just don't recognize it. They just ignore it because once you do hands-on therapy or martial arts, you instantly recognize that, instinctively recognize that what they've told you is all wrong, but you just don't know where to go, so you just ignore it.
Yeah.
Or dance or movement as well.
Right.
Stephen Schafferman, we've
Yeah,
put Kuhn's book up in the, thanks Chris for getting the correct link, but anybody who hasn't read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it's a short book, it's an easy read, and it's so important. Sorry, go ahead, Steve Schafferman.
It's not so short and not so easy, but well worth
exactly what I wanted to say. Yeah.
well worth the attention. I actually was rereading it just last week for the book I'm writing about back pain, and just pointing out that back pain and arthritis and such are obvious anomalies for the medical paradigm. And the fact that medicine cannot suggest a specific cause or specific effective treatments for back pain and is just huge. And yet, as Kuhn describes very effectively, and when people are first confronted with the questions, they often become defensive. And they will look for any kind of excuse to reassert their predispositions and what they were taught early on. And that's why we should celebrate people like Steve, who were willing to live with the questions and to persist in spite of the obstacles. And that's what we're all doing. And it's really delightful to have this community. So I state, and Kuhn's book is well worth reading and rereading. And when I first met Steve in June of 2010 at the Bucky Fuller conference, he then brought some models over to my apartment, and we spent a couple of hours playing with models and talking about Kuhn, and it's well worth reading and rereading.
Yeah, well, the fun for me is that my granddaughter is now a senior at George Mason University here in Northern Virginia, and she's a science major. And I talked her into taking a philosophy course, for the philosophy of science. And the person teaching the course, Nicholson, starts the course reading Kuhn's book and spent the first 2 weeks of the course discussing Kuhn's book. So, I mean, so now the philosophy of science people are well into that concept now, and they're talking about it. And there were challenges to Kuhn's book, and that's this upcoming part. She says, I just saw it the other day, and she said that the next 2 weeks they're going to be discussing the arguments pro and con of Kuhn's book.
Yeah, and that's also what Kuhn talks about, is that once there's an alternative model, once someone presents a new paradigm, then there's an active competition between the old models and the new possibilities. And that's where a lot of productive debate happens.
This is very exciting, Steve, that your granddaughter's taking this course with Nicholson. Have you been in touch with him?
I haven't been in touch with him, but my granddaughter said she got up in class and discussed me one day and talked about my problems with this very problem. She says, "You're the book." It's like Kuhn's wrote a book about me.
So for those of you who don't know Daniel Nicholson's work, I don't know, Chris, if you have that link handy to put in the chat. If you do, please do, because it's the ebook's available at no charge, and it's a $90 book. But it's called Everything Flows. Oxford University Press, really important book. This is very exciting how this all kind of comes around and connects.
New York Times.
Go ahead, Craig.
Oh,
Craig,
muted.
you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting, Steve. And I met Steve in 2001 in Zurich. And we've run a similar course, except I'm an engineer who worked with orthopedic surgeons for 20 years before I met Steve. And the surgeons basically tasked me with finding solutions to what they saw as the problems. They didn't have any solutions. So as an engineer, they gave me the problems and I worked on solving them. And then I ran foul with the biomechanics bunch, which is basically just applied mathematics to the body, which is just taking mathematics and applying it and not really caring whether it actually fits or not. So it's another now 20 years later, and it's about paradigm shifting. Paradigm shift is a paradigm is made up of many components which interlock, and that forms the paradigm. So as scientists, we find one problem and we look at it in depth and we solve it, but that doesn't change the paradigm. It just changes one aspect of the existing paradigm. So you have to build up more and more and more contradictions of the old paradigm, and eventually your solution doesn't look like the old problem anymore. So your paradigm is shift. You created a new paradigm. The old paradigm still exists, and all your problems that you've solved are ignored by the old. And that's how a new paradigm, in my experience, forms. You've got to systematically chip away one by one at all the issues and problems of the old paradigm. And the people who hold the paradigm don't change their mind. You've got to introduce new people come along, the old ones die, and the new paradigm works better, and that's how it shifts. So that's where we are now. We've basically shifting away from the old paradigm, and you've got to see how they interlock. Otherwise, like manual therapists, they have a different paradigm, but they don't interlock at all. So there's no interlocking. It's only by specifically focusing on the interlocking components of the two paradigms that you can actually shift the paradigm. Otherwise, you just end up with different models, and everyone's got different models, and that everyone just sticks to their model. And this joining the models is quite tricky.
Yeah, and Kuhn talks about that quite explicitly, that the proposed new paradigm must preserve the problem-solving capacities of the old, while also solving the anomalies and pointing toward future research questions and possibilities.
That paradigm is also Hegel. Hegel developed a dialectic with thesis and antithesis. And together, when you've got them both, then you can see what the new answer is. They both got to be correct. So it's very tricky, and you've got to basically, it takes a long time and a lot of separate people working on separate problems to put in the new 6 or 7 shifts of specific details that you can then put together to form a new paradigm. And that's how it works. And I think we're getting there now. I've proposed working with Steve to see what we can put together in a more coherent way using both our knowledges. And so perhaps we can get something done soon, if that's okay with Steve.
I'll take all the help I can get.
It's interesting because, and Steve Geiger, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I've been trying to kind of not reconcile, but find the compatibilities between the biomechanics, to just use that word in lack of a better one, that are sort of embedded in the traditional wisdom of Asian internal martial arts, okay, as presented in things like the Tai Chi classics. And I think there's a lot of compatibility. What makes me less comfortable, but I think people almost have to do it to get their minds there, is when they try to bring tensegrity and biotensegrity in, and at the same time talk about lever systems within the body. And, and so they haven't left behind the old biomechanics, and they're trying to figure out how to weave them together. And then we get a lot of people who say, when they're learning about biotensegrity in their first 3 to 5 years, I tried to combine them, and then I realized I couldn't, that I really needed to shift from one to the other. And Steve Geiger, if you've got nothing to say, I do not mean to put you on the spot. I just know that you've been working in Qigong and Taiji for decades and decades.
Well, I do have something to say. I mean, I've been doing this a lot ever since getting, listening to what you're all talking about in the Biotensegrity group. And I think the biggest thing is, your back, and your backbone is just not a bunch of pillars of bone sitting on top of each other, but it's a tensegral unit. And not only that, but then connecting with everything else going down. And it's always going to be a work in progress, but it's something that I don't see written anywhere. It's something that I'm just experiencing myself. And it's nice, it's releasing, because instead of relying on this old kind of football paradigm that you have to have muscle mass everywhere, you just use, what's really just necessary.
Thank you. Craig, you're holding up a soccer ball there. What do you got
You
to
mentioned the football paradigm, the good old football paradigm. Let me just
there we go.
There's the ball, except it's not focusing on it.
I was thinking more of American style football, with muscles everywhere,
Okay, well, this is a truncated icosahedron soccer ball. It has these pentagons and hexagons, and they've, instead of in a plane, if you put 5 hexagons together, they form a ball, and that's the round. And this is basically the model that I'm currently working on, which coordinates levers, tensegrity, the round, and all the anatomical models. And it comes down to this truncated icosahedron. So this is well advanced. I know what I'm doing. It's just a matter of getting it down and getting the opportunity to get it into a model. Let's see if I can get my model focused.
A little closer, yeah.
Okay. So this is a soccer ball which I've cut open, and through every hexagon, every pentagon, there are 12, I've put a stick, which is a cotton earbud, cotton stick, and those then can be aligned internally, so that they form the 6-bar tensegrity structure. The geodesics on the ball, which connect the points, they are the lines of the tensegrity. So the tensegrity is a soccer ball. So they're directly linked. And so, yeah, so that's basically, I've established it for my own purposes. I haven't published it or try to report on it, because that just causes problems. Rather get the job done and then write it up. So there's your soccer ball analogy.
Craig, have you seen that International Mathematical Union logo video that is morphing one set of geometrical shape into the other and shows the relationship of the octahedron, the cuboctahedron, the icosahedron, the Borromean rings, and the six-strut tensegrity. Have you seen that? It might be useful to you. I'm going to find that link.
There's lots of observations that are very useful, but you can get overwhelmed by too many.
Yeah, this is a pretty friendly
this-
video. I'll find it and put it in. And Steve, I'm going to ask you specifically. I know you've got something to say, but you've talked about pentagons and how you have to have 5-sided structures in order to get the circle. And I think early on you were discussing that with somebody who said, no, you can't do that. Can you?
I don't
Can I
remember.
help you there?
Yeah, I don't remember who said they can't do that, but yes, you have to get if you just do hexagonal close packing, you get a flat sheet. In order to get a curve, you have to put the pentagons in. And that's what Craig says, and you get 12 pentagons and you get a sphere. Okay, but what I was going to say is that I have a theory that soccer balls expand and contract auxetically, and that's why they go so far when you kick them, is that they don't distort like linearly. They contract symmetrically, auxetically, like the vector equilibrium, and that's what gives them the extra room to go further than you think they should go when you kick them.
Well, as I said, the soccer ball, the stitching on between the hexagons and the pentagons are the geodesic lines or the tension lines of a tensegrity. So that would be the case, because tensegrity will expand or contract, and if you kick the soccer ball, it will contract and then release the energy by expanding and moving off. So that model is exactly correct. There's no redundancy at all. All the stitches are the tensegrity tensile elements, and it's automatic. If we have a, I get my screen. But this comes from my oats box. My box of oats comes with this logo on the back of it, so I've cut it out. And this is five hexagons around a red hexagon. Now, if you make that middle one a pentagon and you close off this top edge here, then you automatically get the spherical geometry. It's automatic, it's not calculated, it's just simply 5 hexagons stitched together, make a pentagon in the middle, and the 12 of those make a soccer ball. There's nothing complicated about it. It's just natural. So that changed the paradigm away from linear flat planes to a ball, the round, as Susan says. Everything's the round. And Joan Everson also says we are round. And that is the geometrical structure. And there's no calculations, it just simply works. That's just automatic. And it's quite straightforward, really. And Leonardo da Vinci, he recognized the pentagon of the human body. And so if we got our soccer ball and we stand inside it, and that's our frame of reference, it's not an infinite frame of cardinal planes that go on into outer space forever and ever just by adding another one on each direction. It's actually a closed system, and you can actually function.
I had a couple thoughts on the commentary so far. One was a saying that we're talking about changing in paradigms. My mentor always had a saying. He was an old school osteopathic physician, said, is if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so it just fits in with everything has been saying, that you're trying to fit all the information into the paradigm that you do have. But the other observation I had is, like, in the discussion, was the dinosaurs and large mammals and things, that while they can be very fast and powerful, but they're standing on, 3 toes moving forth. It seems to me that that's similar to playing sports today, as most of the thing we talk about is the ready position, which is, slight bend in knees and putting some tension to the system and being on the balls of your toes so you can be able to change your direction and move quickly. So it's like we as humans have figured it out the same way that animals have figured it out. So the system has to make sense, because evolutionary, everybody's doing the same thing.
All right, do we have any more questions or comments?
I just want to share my screen with going back to the toes and the elephant. So I don't know if you've seen this picture, but if I share my screen.
Susan, you need to let him.
Yeah, no, I think he's got permission. Do you have it? Do you have the green square share screen button, Craig?
Yes, I've got it. Can you see that?
No, once you click the green share screen button, you'll get maybe several windows depending on how many you have open on your computer. If you want us to hear any sound from that thing you're about to share, you need to click down on the left, the little square about sharing the audio, and then you select which of the windows you want us to see, and then you go ahead and click the share.
It's not coming.
All right,
it's not sharing the right window, so I'm going to quit here.
Yeah,
but the links in the chat, and I saw this was in the.
Hold on, Craig. The link. What link is in the chat?
The foot.
The Twitter link, the one with the.
The
Reddit. Sorry, it's a Reddit link.
Oh, the Reddit link. Okay, well, I can share it.
Okay.
If you like, hold on just a moment. Then we will have it. Is there sound or no? Well,
no, there's an elephant foot and the human foot.
Okay, here we go. How's that?
Yeah, that shows it. This shows it better than I even imagined it was, because I've seen the elephant foot in the museum in South Africa, and I saw, but this actually shows the whole structure inside. You see, the human foot is exactly inside the elephant. It's the same anatomical structure.
So elephants are wearing high heels.
No, they got flat. They're standing on their toes, and they got.
No,
12
I'm looking at the calcaneus.
Yeah, it's up in the air. Yeah. But the point is, they're standing on the big toe all the time, and there are 12 of them in an elephant. And the elephant is the biggest mammal on Earth, and it's got 12 human big toes. And the human big toe is what makes us bipedal, and which is so that is the similar anatomical structure. Now, I've studied. Try to find my. I've studied the human toe for years and years and years, and when sprinters sprint, they run on the big toe. That's the only connection with the ground. So it is fundamentally important to. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent 20 years studying it. So I think this. It's again small. It's a small insight, and you've got to combine. You need lots of insights, all small ones that combine and form a new model. So, yeah, we got an elephant and the human. A similar anatomical structure, and I know quite well how that works, and it doesn't work with muscles. There are no muscles attached to the human toe, and it works by rotating the It was discovered by Hicks in 1953, Journal of Anatomy. He listed 3 functions of the big toe, and the one that no one pays any attention to is the rotation. So when you
But maybe you can share. Maybe you can share the link to that.
Hicks. I'll put it in the chat. That's to Hicks and Journal of Anatomy, 1953.
Maybe you have the page handy as well.
Yeah, I think it's 88, volume 88.3. I think it's, I don't know.
See if you can pop it in the chat. That would be great. And
I will look it up now. Okay.
I always love it when I find a paper from the, the 50s, the 60s, whenever, and it's got something, all these really delicious nuggets that seem to have been overlooked, dismissed, ignored.
But you see, also, the interesting thing is that the medical texts from up to, say, 50s or 60s, not to mention the ones from the 19th century, they're all readable. They're actually written in a good language. You can, it's a language describing life, sort of. And then if you try to read, the more it goes into current academic specific kind of coded language, the less user-friendly the less kind of it becomes a description, and more it becomes this coded message for the peers who are reviewing it, right? So that's one of those. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So
yeah,
it's actually the earlier literature which we have to kind of go back a lot.
Michelle, you're unmuted. Did you want to say something?
You can hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
First, I should like to thank Leonid, because for me, it's very interesting to present how Steve has offered us Biotensegrity. It's very important to show the different steps. And for me, the step of the dinosaur is very important. And when I heard the first time Steve conference, for me, it was a shock to hear this story of a dinosaur. And I was always thinking about this, and I had understood that it was before meeting the Snelson architecture and conception. And Steve is a real searcher. He goes steps by steps, and it takes time to meditate about this. Let things happen. And for me, it's like this that a real scientific should do. And he is a scientific. And Leonid, during 45 minutes, has put the light about this dinosaur questions. In fact, it's very strong because it's not just anecdote. It's not just. It's a very important moment in his life, and question and answers with people who have an own model. And he was searching a new model. He was the only one who was searching a new model. The other people were not in this case. And it's his way is lonely way and very powerful way. And thank you, Leonid, to take time to show us how things happen.
Well, you see, it was also, like I wanted to figure it out myself, right? So it's a natural, it's a natural curiosity, right? And like how much I respect Steve.
I know.
And the more you dig into it, the more you respect him. So you see, like he can turn his sound off, right? So you see, because basically, as you said, as you go through the steps, so you actually see the integrity through each step. And I find it very, very, I mean, you see, when I was speaking of that, right? So you see, when I was first rewatching it, I felt like, oh, geez, there's so much, there's maybe too much of me in this video. I was trying to get kind of more Steve, but yeah, I just kind of get excited and I try to kind of convert it into, get as many hidden elements exposed, right? Because I think that's really important. So to highlight, right? And I still, I still believe that this highlight that it's, that when we really go in time, right, and unfold the timing, I think that's very important. And well, particularly to sort of disarm these statements about these people are not open to, the critique or constructive critique. There's a cult-like type of thing. So, if you go through this, well, how far, what could be more, what could be further removed from cult than this kind of incremental steps? Just yeah, sorry, Susan, to interrupt.
No, and critical thinking, right? I mean, my critical thinking skills improved directly as a result of working with Steve. I mean, yes, I learned about biotensegrity, but I also improved my ability to think and ask questions. And Leonid, I think when you're doing these interviews, you're really taking that chair for all of us. That's how I see it. So I'm happy at the contributions you make. I want to go back for a second to the dinosaur's tail, because there have been speculations, in the literature about the dinosaur tail being supersonic, like being like able to crack like a whip so quickly that it could break the sound barrier. And then that was proposed, and then it was sort of debunked. But all of these, both the proposal and the debunking in a way, right, are dependent upon the computer model that was used to generate the information, which is dependent upon certain sets of assumptions. And until you actually have a dinosaur tail with you, which we won't be able to do, you can only speculate, you can't validate. And then I was thinking, well, what about prehensile? We talk about the Tyrannosaurus Rex and how it had these teeny tiny little arms. But what if its tail was prehensile? What if that was the arm? It's sort of like we don't get to ask these questions until we're willing to let go of certain paradigmatic structures that we carry around in our own minds, sometimes to the extent that we don't even know it fully. We consciously, we can't fully know to the extent to which that those constructs that we grew up with are influencing our ability to think.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. In a way, you see, like, this is a great question. What if the I believe that the question, what if we start interpreting the tail like an arm, is a lot more productive and important question than trying to make a certain crack the whip type of things, which we would never be able to verify by any means. And it's only the question of what Craig very well put, it's just applied mathematics. So which, and when they do the applied mathematics, they kind of verify it via what could be seen as their kind of physics intuition. But the physics intuition is very much rooted in mechanisms, right? So, and in inanimate world, so we end up kind of, okay, is that the right intuition? And yeah, but this is one of those big things, is that we still carry those habits that we need to unlearn, right? So you see, and that's could be seen very well in the fascia world, right? So you see like fascia, 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 but then at the same time speaking about the bones as if the bones could be really seen as the primary load bearers, right? So, it's like you have to follow this. If you do talk about the networks, and the networks which are so kinematically indeterminate that you cannot really find what exact kind of load, the path of the load distribution it takes, then effectively anything could be anything, right? So you see, like we can count from the head to the toes, recalculating the leadership, we can count from the arm to the arm, arm to the leg, let's say consider the leg to be the arm and whatever else, right? So you see, and in that light, if we start doing it, then that question, like how come that we have the two front limbs and the torso sort of suspended in a hammock? So, like, if that's the case, if the torso is suspended through a hammock on the laterally plastered shoulder blades, then, okay, where is the uniformity there, right? So you see why we wouldn't interpret the hind legs in the same way, disregarding the fact that somehow the hip joint actually seemed to be, like inserted into the pelvis, right? It's like it's a lot of reverse questions and the extensions that we can start bringing, right? So you see, because anatomy is still kind of filled up with the particular cases. Or, what, this is a convenient case of the pelvis where the hips kind of fit in. Ba-bam. But, well, there is also a case of the shoulder girdle where the elephant has the shoulder blades on the side. Like, well, if we are consistent with the fascia ideas, well, there has to be a way to interpret the legs in exactly the same fashion. So, and
it makes me think. So if we had never seen it, let's imagine for a moment that elephants were extinct, right? And we found a bunch of elephant bones. Would we put it together in a way where it would actually end up looking like an elephant? Or would we, using our current set of assumptions, build a very different looking animal, and for how many animals would that be the case? Steve, can I ask you, am I remembering correctly that one of the things that happened when you were exploring around with Nicholas Hotton had to do with the placement, perhaps it was of a sacrum with the pelvis?
But yeah, actually, I go into that. I think in one of our talks, I go into that. The sacrum actually falls out of the pelvis. It hangs there. So in a four-legged animal, the sacrum is actually falling out from the wings of the ilium, and it is suspended just like so. The axial skeleton is still suspended from the limbs. It's not being held up by the limbs. It hangs like a hammock because the sacrum hangs out. And that's in Grant's method of anatomy, which I talked about at one point. It shows you that the sacrum just hangs there and is falling out of the pelvis. So in a quadruped, it would be falling out, and so the axial skeleton is actually suspended in two hammocks, the forelimb and the hind limb. The other thing is that also in that same museum, of course, is a wonderful exhibit on monkeys that I spend a lot of time in that department too. I didn't really talk about the monkeys, but I looked at the tails of monkey. The monkey skeletons are fantastic to look at because some of them are just spirally like bones, but they have big long tails. One time I counted the bones in the monkey tail. I forget now what it was, but it was certainly something like 14 or 15 or more than that. And of course, the muscles are in the same plane as the bones in the tail. There's nothing sticking out that gives you the spinal kind of thing. And so the monkey who has a prehensile tail hangs his body weight from this rope that he wraps around. Essentially it functions just like a rope that it hangs around. So which is nonsense. There's no way of figuring out how to do that in a Levin mechanical system. And of course, if you look at, and of course, then I also looked at snakes for the same reason. And of course, none of it makes any sense. Once you start asking that very question, you can go around through the whole damn museum and ask it over and over again, and you come up with the same answer. You can't use a Levin model to use it for this particular thing. So it's just the same question. You just got to go, once you got the question, all you have to just wander around the museum, which I did, of course, and look at all these different animals telling you exactly the same thing. Lever system doesn't work in a vertebrate creature. And then you get to things like elephants' trunks. I mean, there are no bones in it at all. How does it get stiff? And penises, which is there are some penis bones, but they also float within the penis, and the tongue. So you then start asking. That's what happens, is that once you got this one question, then it leads into similar questions that go down the line.
Mm.
Well, see, I think that's a really good note to kind of pursue, right? So that the questions, they go on, and then there are different, you see, of course, when it comes to the conversations with the professional biomechanists, right? So you see one of the things that kind of triggers their response, in a negative way, is this phrase, "You can't do that," right? So you see, it can't work, right? Because then it becomes a sort of a matter of a challenge for them, and try to juggle and kind of massage the numbers in such a way to prove that, okay, under certain set of very special conditions, you can sort of find a way how it would work, right? So that is, I think historically that's been one of the, kind of battles that occurred. But well, on the other hand, indeed, right? So you see, it's the question which we always have to ask: why do we take why taking the liver model as a minimum, right? So you see, why do you actually start? And that's why every book on biomechanics starts with the convenient elbow model, right? So you see, kind of grossly simplified elbow model. So, and even you see, I've visited my fair share of museums, including this, Galileo Museum in Florence, right? So you see where they have the exhibits of the earliest models of locomotion and the liver. So which would be like from 1700s when this became popular. And the fact is,
Do you have any of those photographs you can post?
oh, I mean,
Is
I will find one. I have a whole
with the
bunch of them.
counterweights and all of that
Yeah,
stuff?
I have a whole bunch of them, right? So I was, like it was during the COVID time that actually I visited, and it was not very populated at all. So it was, so I have plenty of those. So, but the question is that they all end up with the elbow, like this simplified elbow, because it's so convenient, of course, bearing in mind that you disregard the fact that you have the hand, right? So you see, and that, as Craig pointed out, there are no muscles attached to the actual, it's the thing, nothing attached to the big toe, but also the attachments and kind of the muscular control of the actual digits is a very much an open question, right? So even if you just take the percentage of the muscle fibers, which are kind of even in the most like obvious way, right? So, but that's it. So everybody just took the convenience of the liver model, and you can excuse Barelli, right? So you see who was there at the time of the extreme computational scarcity, right? So you see the very fact that he was looking for, the model which would be the most processable as a kind of even pre-calculus days, and I always visualize this. If you are in the kind of years of their, you have a candle, right? So you see you have a very expensive parchment, right? And you have this quill, right? So you see, and you have to do some computations. You don't have anything else. It's a hard, you will be saving on computations. You will be kind of squeezing yourself into the simplest of the models, right? So you see, that's really the case. But we are at the days where we are not limited by that computational scarcity. And then the question is like, why do we take the open full liver range and then kind of start artificially kind of restricting them instead of, like it's a lot of questions which easily pop up, right? So, and I think that that's one of the key points, right? Is that this is what we want to, maybe it's one of the programs that we actually have to start doing is start popping up questions, right? So, and I think that could be actually a good program or a good kind of idea overall. Yes, Craig, please.
Tom Fleming's actually produced a floating fulcrum model. Are you aware of that?
Well, I mean, he has we have a whole number of also replicas of those, which Fernando does quite a lot of replicas, right? So you see the Fernando Tejera, he does a lot of replicas and so on. So yeah, I mean, the models of Tom Fleming's, we also Graham reproduced, I believe, a bunch of them as well. So you see, I mean, I've definitely seen the floating models, but we just need
specifically he released an email, and he had some he had a model with 2 wires across in a plane that were acting as fulcrums, and he produced this floating fulcrum model. It's
okay. So then again, Craig, if you have that,
yeah, I'll send it to you.
So please do. So you see, like, again, I think that this is one of those things that which we can, since now we're in a sort of relatively small compartment there. So you see, we can definitely discuss those, like potentially. So speaking of this, or if we're kind of closing this one, so we're in almost 2 hours there, right? So, maybe that's one of the things that we can kind of even toast for, right? So you see, toast for the open questions, and maybe that's something that we need to look into more kind of deliberately.
Yes, because that model directly addresses the fulcrum issue. It's a direct addressing of it, and it's and I think it's worth investigating it and exploring it.
He actually sent me one. I don't know if I have it. But I disagree that it's a fulcrum in the classic sense of the term. I think it's still within its attention model, and it just is a central point which rotates around it. But he sent me one, and I had a long discussion with him at the time.
I put a link in the chat to an article that he has about that. That's on the Tom Fleming's archive.
But if there is something else that Craig found, you know,
Tom Fleming's archive.
Pardon?
I put a link in the chat to an article in the Tom Fleming's archive where he's talking about the need for levers with floating fulcrums. So, Craig, I don't know if how it connects to the model you're talking about.
Are you in charge of Tom Fleming's archive?
No, Dorothea Blostein is, and she was actually on at the beginning.
She was on, yes. So,
Blostein, I should say.
but she's a classic for biomechanics, unfortunately.
Sorry?
She's more biomechanically inclined.
Yes.
Classically, I think.
Well, I think she's mathematically inclined to mathematical models, and because that's her background. Yeah.
I will send who wants a copy of this, my reduction of Tom Fleming's model. Who should I send it to?
Yeah.
Graham, Leon.
Yes, please do.
Okay. Somebody,
I put a link
down my door, so I have.
Okay. I'll send it to Graham.
I put a link.
Graham will distribute it.
I put a link to Tom Fleming's archive in the chat, intentiondesigns.ca. That's got all the things that Dorothy has put together.
Yes.
Tom's archive.
Because it was specifically an email he sent out just before he passed. I don't know if that was in the archive.
Okay, we'd love to see it. Thank you, Craig.
And I will.
So if you can find it, as an email, because that could be very specific, right? So you see, that could be a compact version, shall I say, right? So compact versions are always a good thing to have.
Okay.
Thank
I'll
you.
figure it out.
All right. Any final thoughts, or? This has really been fabulous.
Okay, so shall we then make a closing toast or whatever, right?
Yes, to questions.
Yes, to questions. Yes.
Present and future, and the humans that ask them.
All right.
Yes.
Cheers.
To answers.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you.
Well, the next part is going to be the one with even, more of the visuals, right? So you see, finally, the sculpture will come in, right? But I think that this one is really good,
Stay tuned for episode 4, and we don't even know how many episodes, do we?
No, there are 20-something, but we haven't finished yet,
Wow. All right. Thanks, everyone. We're going to say goodbye.